Welcome, you're watching youtube.com/NDTV. I'm Ankita Mukherji and this is News of the Hour, where we go beyond the headlines and tell you more about the story that you have voted for. Well, this was the poll that was put out by NDTV this morning, and an overwhelming 72% of you have asked to know more about the rioting and other charges against the women who've been protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act in Lucknow. So what is all of this about? Well, this is in fact quite a recent protest, perhaps inspired by Delhi's Shaheen Bagh, where women protesters have now been occupying the road for over a month now. There have been similar protests in Kolkata, in Prayagraj, and now in Lucknow as well. Now, Friday night, what began as a group of 50 women protesting underneath Lucknow's iconic Ghanta Ghar or clock tower started becoming bigger and bigger. Now, what has happened is, this is something we've seen in protests around the country against the Citizenship Amendment Act. Protests that have begun small have acquired a life of their own, attracting more people. So what began with just 50 women protesting in an indefinite sit-in swelled. We saw hundreds of women gather there, and then as the night progressed, as Friday night progressed, there were literally thousands of women and children who were present in this very central part of Lucknow and protesting underneath the clock tower. So what we saw really was this protest grow exponentially over the next couple of days as well. And on Saturday is where there was an incident which seems to have sparked off these further developments. So what happened, we're told, is that there were some reporters who were speaking to the women protesting at Clock Tower. And that's when a woman police constable tried to intervene. She tried to get between the protesters and the reporters and try and disperse a crowd that had formed around them. She alleges that she was shoved and pushed and manhandled and heckled as she was trying to do her duty. Based on this woman constable's initial FIR, the Uttar Pradesh police has now filed charges against these women protesters. Now, at least 24 women, well, largely women, we're told, have in fact now been charged with rioting as well as unlawful assembly. Now, those charges in themselves raise several questions. Where was the rioting? There was no, by the police's own admission, there has been no destruction whatsoever of public property. Nobody was injured, apart from this one allegation by a woman police constable, and even then she says she was pushed and shoved around rather than actually injured. So how do these protests attract a charge of either rioting or unlawful assembly? Well, set that aside. This is as far as 24 of these women protesters who've been named in that FIR go. There are 135 others who have in fact now been charged by the UP police of literally deterring a public servant from doing their duty, in this case presumably this woman constable, and of disobeying orders promulgated by a public servant. Now, these are normally sort of boilerplate charges that are trotted out every time there is a large gathering. In fact, in Uttar Pradesh, just a few weeks ago, when there was actually violence in Lucknow, we saw far more serious charges being leveled. Take the case of Congress worker and theatre activist Sadaf Jafar, who was actually at a protest merely recording a Facebook Live of the protests that were taking place. She was arrested, charged with charged in fact with not just rioting but also attempted murder, and she was jailed along with former IPS officer S.R. Darapuri and several others, and there were very, very serious charges leveled against these activists. Later on, in bail hearings, the police was forced to admit that they had no evidence to bear out these charges, and that's when these activists got bail. But in the case of these women protesters, the police themselves are saying that there has been no violence, there has been no destruction of public property, and yet on what basis they are filing these charges is of course the big question right now. Who are these women protesters? Well, some of them are rather well known. In fact, two daughters of a very well-known poet, Sumaya Rana and Fawzia Rana, were among these women protesters who were at Lucknow's Ghanta Ghar. They are the daughters of a very famous Urdu poet, Munawar Rana, who is also a Sahitya Academy Award winner. they have actually been named in the police FIR. In the 24 who have actually been named, 135, as we said, unnamed protesters who have been accused of disobedience to order duly promulgated by a public servant and assault or criminal force to deter a public servant from discharging their duty. As we said, boilerplate accusations or boilerplate charges. Now, so we do have the incident of the woman constable, but clearly this has gone far beyond just that. What else do we know about these particular protests? Well, remember on Saturday night, when these women in the bitter cold of Lucknow were out in the open, the police actually stopped blankets from reaching them, and this caused a massive controversy on social media. Blankets and food meant for the women and children who were sitting there out in the open was confiscated by the police. When questioned about this, the police's initial reaction was to deny all of it, and people who were raising these questions were told, don't spread rumors. However, the police found it very difficult to, deny photo and video evidence of them actually seizing these blankets and the food, and that's when they issued a statement saying that these blankets were taken away after due process. So they've already come in for a great deal of criticism that, where in Uttar Pradesh there is so many other questions of law and order, here you have a police force that is going after citizens who are exercising their democratic right to protest, and they are snatching blankets and food from women and children. So at this point, the UP police, perhaps in a sense losing the battle of perception, as it were. They are already under a great deal of criticism for the crackdown during the violent protests that took place in December 2019. Remember, the violence began in Lucknow and then spread to other parts of Uttar Pradesh also, but the crackdown that followed saw 21 people losing their lives. That's the maximum number of casualties in any state in connection with the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests. So the Uttar Pradesh police still has a lot to answer for on that. And now you have them in another protest, a peaceful protest, a protest where there's been no violence or any kind of other untoward activity. Here they are registering cases and filing charges against largely women protesters. And there were also, as we said, children present over there. So what else do we know today? Well, today's developments included a pro-Citizenship Amendment Act protest rally in Lucknow, and this was led by Union Home Minister Amit Shah. And not only did he do that, he also spoke at length at that rally and effectively said, regardless of the protest, regardless of what the opposition is saying about the Citizenship Amendment Act, and remember, the government is doing this massive outreach where many ministers are now trying to take the government's message on the new citizenship law to the citizens to say, don't get taken in by what the opposition is saying. This is the truth. What they're telling you is in fact a creative reinterpretation or lies or whatever you choose to call it. Well, Amit Shah effectively had a very firm message for the protesters, saying no matter how much you protest, this law is not going to be taken back. He also challenged opposition leaders to a debate, and he said they've been blinded by vote bank politics at this point, and that is what is happening, and that is what is really giving way to these massive protests that are taking place around the country. However, be that as it may, are the protests diminishing in any way? Are they only politically fueled? Well, those are the questions it seems the government now needs to ask itself. The protests have been taking place not just in non-BJP ruled states, but in many BJP states as well. They're spontaneous in many cases. They don't have any kind of political backing, or they're certainly not being led by political leaders. So all of these are things that perhaps the government now needs to take into account. As for the women protesters of Lucknow, those protests are continuing despite those charges now leveled against them. Can these charges stand up in a bail hearing? Well, that's something we'll have to wait and see. Certainly earlier serious charges placed on protesters have failed to stick, and perhaps this will be a similar case. Thanks for watching youtube.com/NDTV. We're going to keep you updated on all the latest big headlines.